The following is a keynote speaker presentation from the ACM 97 conference, The Next 50 Years of Computing. ACM 97 brought together over 2,000 leaders and luminaries from all aspects of the computing world to discuss and predict what the next 50 years of computing has in store. ACM 97 underwriters were Computer World, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Microsoft, and Sun Microsystems. Sponsors were Cadmus Journal Services, IBM, Netscape, Popular Science, Sheridan Printing Company Incorporated, Silicon Graphics Incorporated, SoftBank, and Unisys. The event also included a major exposition with a paleotechnic look back to the future from the year 2047, and a specially commissioned book, Beyond Calculation, featuring essays on the next 50 years of computing by luminaries and pioneers in the field. The ACM 97 conference was chaired by Robert Metcalf and emceed by James Burke. Details on how to obtain more information on ACM 97 follow this program.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Burke.
Our final speaker this morning started out in the personal computer business as a programmer, software designer, marketeer, producer, and researcher. And her academic background is in theater, with a PhD in theater from Ohio State. So either she's a gamekeeper turned poacher or a poacher turned gamekeeper. Either way, she's going to make you think. She began the main body of her work when she went to Atari in '82 and started work on software architectures and interfaces for computer-based interactive fantasy systems. Since '87, she's worked as a consultant in interactive entertainment and interface designs for clients such as Apple, American Interactive Media, Fujitsu, Carnegie Mellon, Lucasfilms, Sony, and Paramount. In 1990, she founded Telepresence Research to develop virtual reality and remote presence technology. In '92, she joined Interval Research Corporation, where she is now, as a member of the research staff. And there she led a 3-year project to explore how age and gender influence children's play. In '96, she co-founded and became vice president for design of a new company called Purple Moon, where she's working on a project to develop interactive systems for young girls based on her earlier research. Because, refreshingly, in this age of PC, she believes that young girls are different from young boys. She was editor of the book, The Art of Human-Computer Interface Design, and then in 1991 she authored Computers as Theater, and more recently a book on computers, art, and nature with the intriguing title of Severed Heads. Here to shake up yours on the subject of information technology and culture is Brenda Laurel.
I want to start with telling you a story about my first computer. It was Halloween and I was almost 12 years old. It was a year when extra big everyday things were the most popular sort of costume. I think it was Andy Warhol's influence on popular culture. Perhaps because we lived in Indiana, my mother had the idea of dressing me as an ear of corn. In my grandmother's basement, she fitted me with a chicken wire frame, and she took tin snips and cut out little armholes, and then she took cotton cloth and stapled kernels onto the chicken wire and made crisp green taffeta leaves to camouflage my arms and gold yarn tassels at the top that tended to fall down over the little eye holes. Every year, the local shopping center, a place called Devington, sponsored a Halloween contest, and the year I was an ear of corn, my mother was certain that I would win. She had carefully clipped the announcement out of the local paper, and we arrived at the shopping center on that evening, and she pulled the ear out of the trunk and slipped it over my head. The little eye holes gave me tunnel vision, and I couldn't bend in any direction, and I couldn't take very big steps without scraping the skin off of my shins with the raw edges of the chicken wire. So we made our way slowly to the tent, tottering ear of corn and a small, purposeful woman. We arrived at the tent only to find it empty. My mother dug the clipping out of her purse. She checked the time, she checked the date. What had happened? She read that the contest organizer was the manager of the Ace hardware store at the other end of the mall, so she took my hand and dragged me resolutely down the sidewalk as fast as I could waddle. When we got to the hardware store, I was temporarily blinded by the fluorescent light pouring in the little eye holes, and my mother dragged me back to the counter. "What happened to the costume contest?" she demanded. I couldn't see the manager, but I could hear his voice. Well, we actually finished early since everyone showed up at 7. We went ahead. "How could you do that?" my mother said. "Can't you see that my daughter would have won? And that we were on time in the right place? What can I tell her now?" All the little noises in the store went silent. I knew that other people were watching. I felt that I'd become an object of wonder and pity. The manager hesitated, and then he proclaimed loudly, taking in the other customers, I will give your daughter a prize. She's a wonderful ear of corn." And so he led us down the aisle, and my leaves swept little hardware store things off onto the floor as I passed by. We stopped at a little toy shelf, and the manager picked up what looked like a gray plastic box with the word ENIAC printed on it. He held it right in front of my little eye holes to demonstrate its operation. He showed me a small card with a question printed on it. "What is the distance of the Earth from the sun?" And then he inserted the card into the plastic box and turned a crank, and a card came out the other end that said 92,876,479.56. "You see," he said, "it's a computer. It can answer questions, all kinds of questions. Here are the questions right here." And he held up a little pack of cards that presumably contained all of the important questions anyone might ever want to ask. "All you have to do is feed these into the computer," he said. Well, I had an epiphany. For a moment, I was transported out of my chicken wire cage, out of the world of typewriters and school books, and into a glorious age when computers would answer all the really hard questions for us. Perhaps the computer might even tell me what I was doing dressed as an ear of corn in the hardware store. "Thank you," my mother said graciously. "Next year, please run your contest on time." "I will, ma'am." And the manager shook one of my leaves and he said, "I'm sorry, honey, you look great, and I hope you enjoy your computer." Well, like everybody else here, I wanted to look forward by looking back to start with. My story was set in 1962, 34 years ago. America was in its duck and cover Dick and Jane period, and the space program was glittering hopefully in the distance. Computers were doing a lot of things that nobody knew about, but the plastic ENIAC and the hardware store man's explanation of it perfectly captured the predominant view of computers in popular culture. This simple techno-optimism was consistent with the idea of progress that characterized the industrial age. But techno-optimism also contained a poisonous seed of self-doubt. People ask questions, computers bestow answers. And the promise was that we could let them do a whole lot of things for us, but the fear was that if we gave them the power to make decisions, we would lose control over them and therefore of our own destiny. After all, computers were blooming as a cultural icon in the deeply anxious period of the Cold War. So our fears burst out in cautionary tales like a film called Colossus, the Forbin Project, made in 1970, about the super defense computers of Russia and the United States. The computers are portrayed as uber beings with intrinsically amoral natures. They turn on their masters, both good and evil, force them into submission, and attempt to take over the world. And this dark view, the shadow duel of techno-optimism, is continuously represented in films since that time, 2001 in '68, Westworld in '73, Demon Seed in 1977, War Games in '83, Terminator in '84. By contrast, Star Trek, which was born in 1966, tempered techno-optimism with humanism. So, except in the case of the occasional and often comical malfunction, Captain Kirk was the master of his computers. In several episodes, he actually caused computers, or robots with computers for brains, to explode by asking them paradoxical questions. So technology was always saving the day, but only with wise, benevolent humans at the helm. Well, this theme also predominates in Star Wars, and it continues to thrive in all of the permutations of Star Trek, as well as in contemporary films like Jurassic Park, where a Unix-literate girl as well can save the world from disaster with the help of a graphical interface. And in Independence Day, where a nerd with a power book can defeat the scariest imaginable alien technology. My point here is that the computer serves as a projection surface for our hopes and our fears about what it means to be human in these times. It's an important new character in our cultural mythology. Joseph Campbell said that we live in a mythological field with a hardwired need and capacity to respond deeply to the symbols that our culture provides. And he also cautioned that culture fails us when our symbols are not vitally connected to our lives. So, as a cultural symbol, does the computer provide that vital connection to our lives that keeps our culture well? Is the computer a good mythical character? What is the ethos of the computer, its distinct characteristics, its moral nature, its guiding principles? It shows up as an innocuous, zippy little appliance and a world-dominating, soulless megalomaniac, and we recognize it in both roles. It recites nursery rhymes without comprehension, and it locks us out of the pod bay, and we recognize it in both kinds of actions. An athlete hurls a javelin into its big brother eye, and then it pops up again as a little box with a self-effacing smile on its own little screen, and we recognize it in both disguises. Because although it can speak with a human voice or display a human face, we know it is not human. It is a brain in a box, without a body or a soul, without intuition or passion or morality. It's the last stop on the road to mind-body dualism. It's a severed head, severed from the body of what it means to be human. It's also a mega head, a hypertrophied brain that can become dangerous if it's embodied or self-aware. Indeed, it's different from us, but it's also similar enough to us that we think of it no longer as a machine or as a tool, but as an other in relation to the human self. It functions in our cultural mythology to express dualities, mind and body, other and self, logic and compassion, reason and intuition, technology and nature. Yes, we made the computer, but in its role as a cultural symbol, the computer also makes us. And so you gotta ask yourself, what kind of future has this character in it? And if you don't particularly like the answer, then you have to turn the question around. What kind of character can act out a future that we would like to live in? Forgive me for the water. I've had a cold and I'm all dried up. My point is that cultural narratives coax technologies into being, and vice versa. So that's why the Apollo space program owes a debt to H.G. Wells. It's also why Ronald Reagan's pet defense technology was nicknamed Star Wars. It's why slick commercials of beautifully dressed housewives effortlessly operating chrome-plated appliances lured women out of the post-World War II workplace. It's why that young pilot in the Gulf War compared his bombing mission to a video game. It's why girls have had such a hard time catching up to boys in computing. And it's also why computer software and technology invented by and for females will change both the technology and the ethos of computing. Culture and technology exist in a dynamic, reciprocal relationship. Culture comprehends technology through the means of narratives and myths, and those narratives influence the future shape and purposes of technology. The culture-technology circuit is at the heart of cultural evolution. And as we become more capable of radically altering the conditions affecting our biological survival through technological means, cultural evolution becomes the primary factor in our species' ability to survive. And so the stories that we tell quite literally influence our fate as a species. In his book, Wonderful Life, Stephen Jay Gould observes that the two traits that distinguish human beings from their forebears are abstract reasoning and representational art. Tool use was not sufficient to lead to us. Other tool-using humanoid species died out. And Gould points out that humanity is, and I quote, an improbable and fragile entity, fortunately successful after precarious beginnings as a small population in Africa, and not the predictable end of a global tendency. End quote. In other words, we are unlikely. We are not a done deal, nor would evolution predict that we're to be the progenitors of an even more intelligent species than ourselves. The story of evolution is neither the unfolding of a divine plan, nor the inevitable march of sentience towards grander and grander manifestations. Rather, extinction is the rule. We are much more likely to die out than to transform into a self-aware, infinitely smart, infinitely wise collective shrouded in white light, the internet notwithstanding. As far as evolutionary history would predict, the same set of traits that got us into this mess are the ones that will have to get us out of it, namely abstract reasoning and representational art. Now, computers, it turns out, are extremely good at augmenting both activities. Coincidence? When I look into the future, I'm afraid of what I see. I see a world where dominator politics prevail, where human rights abuses multiply in direct relation to increasing poverty and overpopulation. I see world religions in a state of rigor mortis with a death grip on science and art and the exchange of ideas. I see the red rocks of Utah riddled with coal mines and the Amazon a scarred wasteland. Worst of all, I see a people in the world who can't talk to each other in any meaningful way. Global networking is a tool of business communication, consumerism, propaganda, banal conversations, mindless entertainment. We will have all forgotten how to tell stories and how to hear them. The majority of the world's population will be very young, people without extended families or intact cultures, with fanatical allegiances to dead religions or live dictatorships. We will have what Jonas Salk called a wisdom deficit, fewer elders and even fewer people who listen to them. Well, I think if we can manifest a different future, we must. And I think the way this is accomplished is to activate the culture technology circuit. And so I think what's needed is an intervention at the level of popular culture. Now, many of you are making such conscious interventions, mindfully creating technologies that cause us to produce new myths, and mindfully making art that influences the shape of technology. So I want to spend the next few minutes describing a couple of interventions. As all of you know, it's tricky stuff inserting new material into the cultural organism without activating its immune system. Many artists are content to live on the margin and find their gratification in self-expression. It takes special courage and passion to engage in popular culture. Well, the first example I want to explore is that aging whiz kid virtual reality. From its strange childhood in government labs and military establishments, VR has emerged as a major concept in the pop culture scene of the late 1980s. It was hailed as the techno wave of the future, with the potential to transform everything from movies to medical imaging, and we see some great examples next door. It was also demonized as the latest in mind-controlled drugs and the world's baddest war machine. Philosophers adopted it as a platform for renewed debates about the nature of reality. And nearly everyone agreed that a head-mounted display would give you a look inside Pandora's black box. The mythos of VR reflected our sense of an uncertain future. It became a many-faceted icon for the coming weird times. Why? I think one key to the power of VR as a symbol is that it was essentially unexpected. It was not a logical successor to the brain in a box. In fact, VR turned computers inside out. The brain in a box computer has no body. VR uses our bodies as its instrument. Rather than presenting framed pictures and pull-down menus, VR gives us first-person, body-centric views. Computers, even today's frisky little portables, immobilize the body in front of a keyboard and screen. Conversely, VR relies upon human movement and kinesthetic sensation to achieve its effect. VR qualifies as what Marshall McLuhan described as an anti-environment, an inversion that turns the existing environment into an object of attention, criticism, and scrutiny. Well, as you all know, turning things out is an extremely powerful technique. In fact, inversions have given us some of our greatest leaps in culture and technology and consciousness. In his book, Myths to Live By, Joseph Campbell describes the change in our consciousness that resulted of our first view of the Earth from space, seeing our blue planet alone in the starry black. Campbell says we suddenly understood that rather than coming into this world, we come out of it. Or, as Alan Watts says, as a vine grapes, so the earth peoples. This inversion had a lot to do with the success of the Gaia hypothesis, both as a new area of scientific investigation and as a new popular mythology for our relationship to our planet. My friend and philosopher, Terence McKenna, muses about this fascination with turning things inside out. He says that's what made us manifest computers in the first place. He said it was our attempt to create an instrumentality that could, as he put it, textualize the world and exteriorize the soul. VR certainly textualizes the world in the sense that it simulates reality, but the tasks for which it was originally developed, like flight simulation training and remote operations in nuclear reactors, can hardly qualify as exteriorizations of the soul. Even so, the inversion inherent in VR activated the culture technology circuit. The public's fancy was engaged, and the time was ripe for some interventions. I was fortunate enough to be involved in one of them. It was a project called Placeholder that my friend Rachel Strickland and I had been cooking up for years before the Banff Center for the Arts and Interval Research gave us a chance to actually produce it. So with our colleagues Michael Neymark, Rob Tao, John Harrison, and a bunch of other crazy people, we created 3 connected virtual environments, each of which represented an actual place in the local Canadian landscape. The cave was a dark, drippy space represented as a 3D acoustic environment, which revealed its shapes and textures through sounds. And we represented a stand of hoodoos as a tiled globe of photographic images, and a high waterfall as a full-motion video stretched around a virtual relief projection screen. 2 participants came into Placeholder together, entering for obvious Jungian reasons in the cave. At first, participants could see one another only as tiny points of light that defined their hands, but they had 2 of them, unlike most virtual worlds in those days where the data glove was a right-handed device. Well, presently you would notice petroglyphs, how trendy, of animals on the walls of the cave. Animals like fish and spider and snake and crow, and they'd start to beckon you to come closer and talk to you about themselves. So for instance, crow would say, "I am the eye of the world. I see everything that shines and glitters." And if you walked over to him and your head intersected with his petroglyph, you would find that you'd become embodied as crow. And the other person in the room would see crow change color and peel off the wall and begin to move around. And if you spoke, you found that your voice sounded like crow's voice. And the best part was if you flapped your arms, you found that you could fly. We called these animal suits smart costumes, and there were portals between the worlds, spiral-shaped petroglyphs, and there were special rocks where you could leave voice messages called voice marks in the world. And people would arrange these rocks and their messages into little story lattices like audio graffiti. I call this piece an intervention because we created it with the conscious intention of being able to tell a different story about the medium, about virtual reality, in hopes of influencing the future of the medium by the culture technology circuit. So for example, at that time, most people were describing VR as an out-of-body experience. And the point of asking human beings to put on the bodies of animals was to bring their attention to the fact that they had bodies in virtual environments. And the point of modeling the natural world was to address the common fear that VR would somehow replace the real world for people who became addicted to it. Our intent was to invert this idea, to use virtual reality in the way that Ansel Adams used photography, to point to beauty, to say, notice this, to honor and to celebrate the natural world and the ways in which it articulates with our imaginations. Well, I'm happy to say that this work, although it was nowhere near to being a complete realization of our dreams, inspired a lot of talking and thinking and reworking of the idea of VR, and it influenced the creation of more works that I would call poetic or spiritual. The best example that I know of is a piece called Osmos by Shar Davies of Soft Image, which was also implemented by John Harrison, the person who worked on Placeholder. This piece has been touring for 2 years, and I think it's the finest work of art created in the VR medium to date. In Osmos, one person explores a multi-layered world of light and shape and organic forms and almost painfully gorgeous imagery and motion. Shar loves scuba diving, and for this VR piece, she and her team invented an interface device that uses human breath to navigate, much in the same way as a diver inhales to rise and exhales to descend underwater. It's amazing what happens to people when they breathe consciously. Everybody looks like they're doing Tai Chi. People who've never experienced VR before they entered Osmos reported to Shar that they'd had transcendental experiences or that they'd felt profound peace and joy. One of the construction workers who helped to install the piece in Montreal said after experiencing that he was no longer afraid of death. But when she reports some of these remarkable responses to gatherings of new media artists and critics, Shar is routinely criticized for doing visionary work, which is somehow, by definition, irrelevant. One critic complained, "It is too beautiful. Why is there not a leaf lying next to a dead body in Bosnia?" How tragic that artists have come to hold the self-marginalizing belief that cynicism is superior to hope. To my mind, there's nothing healthier than rolling up one's sleeves and trying to give the world fresh visions of joy, fresh uses of technology that indeed exteriorize the soul. Critics notwithstanding, for the thousands of people whose consciousness was transformed by Osmos, Shar Davies made a breath-giving innovation. The last sort of intervention I want to talk about has to do with storytelling. As Bran Farren pointed out, storytelling is kind of a holy grail in the interactivity business. But storytelling is not simply the transmission of narrative material. It's a purposeful action that is intended to communicate, to heal, to teach. Stories are content. Storytelling is relationship. And throughout our history, cultures and families and individual lives have been held together by webs of storytelling relationships. Now, we're all familiar with the grand storytelling that happens at the level of a culture at large. The Homeric myths, the classical Greek theater, the plays of Shakespeare are of such a scale. Whether we're talking about myths or plays or novels or movies, these grand stories serve as a means whereby a culture can behold itself as a whole. But they also serve as healings. They're presenting illuminations that attempt to help us see where we are, how we got here, what's important, where we should go next. Well, we have no shortage of grand storytellers and grand storytelling technologies in the 20th century, and I'm sure we won't in the 21st. But grand storytelling fills only part of our species' need for narrative. Now, there are lots of other kinds of stories floating around in our culture today: soap operas, comic strips, romance novels, stories of lost children on milk cartons. Contemporary media, especially television, allows us to feel as if we're constantly in touch, always looking through our electronic window at the living heart of our culture. And through witnessing of what we suppose to be common experience, we have the illusion of relationship. But a talk show host is not your grandmother or your aunt or your friend who cares about you. We're vitally interested in the news, even though, as Neil Postman observed, the news generally consists of stories that happen somewhere else to other people and about which we can take no meaningful action. Grand storytelling functions fairly well in broadcast media, but personal storytelling, The giving of a tale by an individual as a teaching or a healing for a particular group or person is an endangered sensibility in American popular culture. Over the last 5 years, I've been involved in a large-scale research project focused on the relationships between age and gender and play in American children. And as we talked to thousands of children across the country, we learned some things about stories and storytelling. For example, very few of the children we talked to said that they ever asked an adult to tell them a story. Well, did your parents tell you stories anyway? Well, yeah, I suppose. Well, they read me books when I was little. And Grandma and Grandpa live in another state, or they've passed away, their stories with them. The art of storytelling still flourishes in certain ethnic groups. And the practice of live storytelling as concert-style entertainment has gaining popularity in the last 5 or 6 years. But for most American school children, storytelling exists, if at all, as a novelty encountered in a school assembly. Now, luckily, there are some interventions afoot on the World Wide Web and in multimedia. Artists like Abby Dunn, who weaves together the family stories of 4 generations of Jewish women as an example of how personal storytelling relationships can be enhanced by multimedia. Derek Pawazek's website, fray.com, a gallery for personal stories and a starting place for storytelling relationships. Well, here's another story from our research. Recently, we've been testing some software concepts geared towards girls. Oddly enough, one of the concepts has to do with storytelling. We were really surprised that this raised a red flag with some parents. I remember one concerned father in Los Angeles saying, well, this seems to be a lot about values. Whose values are these? I'm not sure I want a computer teaching my daughter values. A little bit later in the same session, we asked that same father about how he felt about the values represented in games like Mortal Kombat and Killer Instinct, and unhesitatingly he replied, oh, those games don't have any values in them. They're not about values. Isn't that stunning? The values embedded in mainstream video games are so pervasive and so unquestioned that they're virtually invisible to a concerned parent. But of course, when a kid is engaged in imaginative play, with or without a computer, the whole self is hanging open. The values category is hanging wide open, trying things on, feeling things out. And if we don't design what goes in there on purpose, we're nevertheless responsible for what falls in there by default. We humans are perpetually constructing ourselves. That is the central project of the young. We construct our personal identities, we construct our culture, we construct our future, we construct our possibilities. But with what materials? Stories and video games and movies and websites and artworks don't have to be about values to have a profound influence on values. Values are everywhere. Values are embedded in every aspect of our culture. They're lurking in the very natures of our media and our technology, and the question isn't whether they're there or not, but who's taking responsibility for them, how they're being shaped, and how they are shaping us and our future. The plastic ENIAC in my story contained values. The computers, the questions, the answers are all a closed system. All the person gets to do is turn the crank. I think it's time that we change that story. The questions and the answers are human. And the computer needs to be human too. As human as language, as human as a thumb, as a talisman, as a fairy tale, as a song. I'm going to leave you with one more story about a computer. This is a story from the future. And I'll drink one last hit of this great water. There was a little girl walking in the woods. Her grandmother had been in those woods many times, and so had her mom and her dad and her older brother and some other people long ago, and special friends when she invited them. Some magical beings lived there too, she thought, because she'd seen glimpses of them, and sometimes they left her secret, beautiful treasures. The girl went to the woods when she needed quiet, when she needed time to think. And sometimes she would take her friend with her, but there were some places in the woods, her woods, where she would only go alone. There was a certain path she would take when she was feeling sad. And there was a clear little stream where she would go sit when she was worried, and a waterfall that she would visit when she was feeling excited about something. And sometimes she would fly with the owl at night and look at the world through huge golden eyes. And sometimes she would visit the wise salmon who lived at the bottom of a deep purple pool. She would always find things in the woods, gentle-eyed wild creatures, beautiful stones with stories and secrets inside of them, pictures, messages from her relatives and her ancestors and her secret friends, notes that she'd left herself. So she collected these things, and she took them to a special place in the woods where she arranged them in beautiful patterns, and she knew that there would always be more things to discover in the woods, her woods, and that someday her own children will walk there too, and they would find her stories and her memories and the patterns of her dreams.